Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, you've joined the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, or CSB's public business meeting. We will now begin this meeting with Steve Owens, the chairperson of the CSB.
Well, thank you, Ray, and hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us here today. As Ray said, I am Steve Owens. I'm the chairperson of the Chemical Safety Board, and welcome to our second public meeting of 2024. You know, this has already been a very busy year for the CSB. In addition to eliminating the backlog, as we discussed back in our last meeting in January, we've undertaken a number of activities that we'll be talking about here today. But before we get into that, I just want to remind everybody what the situation was like in July 2022 when I became the interim executive of the CSB and our former chairperson had only recently resigned. And as I said in our public meeting in January, at that time, the agency had an unacceptable backlog of 17 open investigations that had accumulated under prior agency leadership, some dating as far back as 2016. But we got to work, and between July 2022 and December 2023, we issued 17 investigations in 17 months. And as I've said, these are the most reports that the CSB has ever issued in such a short period of time, and they represented the highest level of productivity in the CSB's history. But now with the backlog eliminated, we are able to refocus our resources on other matters that have needed attention for quite a while. And in particular, since we've eliminated the backlog, we have the ability to address other serious chemical incidents that have been reported to the agency under our accidental release reporting rule. For example, earlier this month, we launched investigations into toxic chemical releases at 2 facilities in Louisiana that were reported to the CSB last year. The first is the release of hydrogen fluoride and chlorine at the Honeywell Performance Materials facility in Geismar, Louisiana, that occurred in January of 2023. The second is the release of ethylene oxide at the Dow Chemical facility in Plaquemine, Louisiana, that occurred in July of last year. Unfortunately, no one was seriously injured or killed in either of these events, but both involved the release of highly toxic chemicals that could have put workers and nearby residents at serious risk under different circumstances. And we want to make sure that similar incidents do not happen at these facilities again. We've also been able to move forward aggressively with 2 other current investigations. The first is the September 2022 fatal fire at the BP Husky refinery near Toledo, Ohio, that tragically took the lives of 2 brothers who worked at the refinery. We released an update on this investigation last year, and we anticipate issuing the final investigation report by June 30 of this year. The second is the November 2023 fire at the Marathon Renewables facility in Martinez, California, that seriously injured an employee who suffered 3rd-degree burns over most of his face and body. We were able to initiate this investigation late last year because of the progress we've made toward eliminating the backlog at that time. We released an update on this investigation earlier this year in February, and you'll hear more about this investigation a little bit later in this meeting. So if you're keeping track, this means that, taken all together, the CSB now has 4 ongoing investigations currently underway: the BP, Marathon, Honeywell, and Dow. And so during today's meeting, we'll hear presentations from CSB staff about our work on the accidental release reporting rule, the Marathon investigation, and the Honeywell and Dow investigations. We'll also hear presentations about recent developments relating to recommendations that we've issued in several other investigations. But before I turn the floor over to my fellow board members for their remarks, I want to take care of one bit of housekeeping, as we do at each of our meetings. At the end of today's presentations, we'll provide an opportunity for public comments. And in the interest of time, we ask that you please keep your comments to 3 minutes, and please use the icon on your screen to raise your hand so that you can be recognized to speak. If you'd prefer to submit written comments rather than raising them here on this call, you can send them to public@csb.gov. That's public, P-U-B-L-I-C, @csb.gov. Now I'd like to turn this over to board member Sylvia Johnson for her remarks, and then to board member Kathy Sandoval. Sylvia, please go ahead, and then Kathy, please do so as well when Sylvia has concluded. And thank you all again for being here. So Sylvia.
Thank you, Steve, and welcome everyone to the second quarterly board meeting of 2024. Earlier this week, I had the opportunity to once again speak at the National Association of Title III Program Officials, or NASPO's, annual meeting in Charlotte, North Carolina. Emergency responders are often the first on the scene when catastrophic events happen, and they are a vital stakeholder in the work of the CSB. In the 6 months since I last met with NASPO, the CSB has continued to rebuild and revitalize, and we closed the longstanding backlog. So in addition to sharing with NASPO attendees what the CSB has done in these two important areas, I also highlighted information on CSB's lessons learned in the areas of emergency preparedness and extreme weather events. First responders are vital in growing the CSB's rapport with our state and local partners. Before I turn things over to my colleague Kathy, I'd like to remind everyone that on April 28th, the nation will once again observe Workers' Memorial Day. The first observance was on April 28th in 1989, making this the 35th year since we began honoring the lives of those lost on the job. Although it is a day of mourning for workers who have been fatally injured at work, let's mark this 35th anniversary with an additional action by being mindful that there are things we can all do as professionals to make meaningful changes. We should all be thinking about ways we can work together to reduce workplace fatalities. You're about to hear an update from our Director of Recommendations on some of the most recent recommendation status changes on which we, the board, have voted. As this information is being presented, let's be reminded of the connections between these recommendations and their impact on moving us one step closer to healthier and safer workplaces. I think we all long for the day when Workers' Memorial Day will no longer be needed. And until then, there's a lot more work to be done. Again, welcome to the meeting, and I'll now turn it over to my colleague, Kathy.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, Dr. Johnson, and Chairperson Owens. So welcome to the CSB quarterly board meeting. It's a pleasure to be here. As Chairperson Owens mentioned, the CSB has been busy. We concluded our investigations, but our work has continued on many fronts, including on the outreach front. I spoke last month to the University of Houston Law Center about the CSB's investigations in the Houston and Texas area, specifically focusing on the investigations into the ITC incident, Watson and Wendland, all of which we closed and issued reports on last year. So the event was well attended. We had, in addition to the people in the room, more than 200 members of the Houston legal and greater community attending virtually. So really great to be able to have that outreach to increase understanding about both what happened and to increase awareness of our recommendations so that we can prevent similar incidents from happening. So as was mentioned, the CSB is working hard to finalize our outstanding investigations into BP Husky and also Martinez. And we've opened 2 new investigations. So we are very busily working on that, while we're also working on monitoring recommendations. So it's important that to emphasize that after the reports are issued, the work continues to monitor the progress for our recommendations that we make to government entities, but also to standard setting bodies, to associations, to operators, and to those who have an opportunity to promote chemical and therefore worker and community and environmental safety. So we look forward to hearing more today about our work, and I'd like to thank everyone at the CSB for their work to promote chemical safety and thereby protect workers, communities, and the environment. So thank you.
Well, great. Well, thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Kathy, for those great remarks. Now, what I'd like to do is turn it over to our Executive Director of Investigations and Recommendations, Steve Kleist, to present the reports on the investigations as well as the recommendations that I mentioned earlier. So Steve, take it away.
Thank you, Chairperson Owens. We have a total of 5 presentations that we're going to have this afternoon. 3 will be made by the Office of Recommendations and 2 will be made by the investigation group. The first series of first presentations we made by recommendations, and that will include Amanda Johnson, Adam Henson, and Chuck Barbie. So I'd like to proceed with the first presentation. So Adam Henson, if you can proceed with yours, please.
Thank you, Executive Director Kleist. If you could advance the slide 2, please. One more, please. On April 8th, 2011, an explosion and fire occurred at the Ceased Fireworks storage magazine in Waipahu, Hawaii. This incident fatally injured 5 workers and spared the life of 1 worker who happened to step outside of the magazine to take a phone call minutes before the incident. The CSB's investigation into this incident found that the practices employed by these employees and this company were far from appropriate or standard. As a result of our investigation, the CSB issued a recommendation to the National Fire Protection Association, calling upon them to develop best practices for the safe disposal of waste fireworks consistent with environmental requirements. Next slide, please. Following the recommendation, the NFPA began implementation by forming the Technical Committee on Hazardous Waste, which included representatives from private industry, federal and local government, as well as special experts. After a considerable period of time passed, these experts worked together to form what is published in this December as NFPA 401. NFPA 401 contains actionable guidance on the disposal of not only waste fireworks, but all flammable and reactive wastes that had, if existed at the time and been followed, would have easily prevented and or mitigated the consequences of this incident. The board voted recently to close this recommendation acceptable action, and we commend the NFPA staff and the technical committee for the work that they performed in the drafting of this document. Thank you. I will turn it over to Amanda Johnson.
Thanks, Adam. On April 2nd, 2010, the Tesoro Anacortes refinery experienced a catastrophic heat exchanger rupture in its NH2 unit due to high temperature hydrogen attack. The rupture resulted in 7 worker fatalities. As a result of its investigation, the CSB issued a recommendation to the state of Washington to augment their existing process safety management regulations for petroleum. Oops, sorry, I guess my video is not working. Give me 1 second. Well, I'll keep going while it's thinking. So they made a recommendation to the state of Washington to augment its PHA regulations for petroleum refineries with more rigorous attributes, including a more comprehensive PHA that includes documented damage mechanism hazard reviews, a documented use of inherently safer systems analysis, and the hierarchy of control to the greatest extent feasible. Also included review of PHAs and inspections by the regulator, an increased role for workers in the management of process safety, including the authority to stop work, and the reporting of information to the public to the greatest extent feasible. On December 27th, 2023, Washington Labor and Industries finalized its rulemaking to provide for additional PSM requirements for petroleum refineries in the state of Washington. The regulation, which is modeled after California's PSM regulation for petroleum refineries, goes into effect on December 27th of this year. The regulation requires refineries to conduct damage mechanism hazard reviews, conduct an inherently safer systems analysis. Actually, sorry, do you mind going to the next slide? Implement a human factors program, utilize root cause analysis and investigations, Perform a more robust hazard analysis that includes analysis of the effectiveness of safeguards and provides workers with stop work authority. On March 14th, 2024, the CSB closed this recommendation as acceptable alternative. This regulation is a big win for process safety and for the state of Washington and its refinery workers. I will now turn it over to Mr. Chuck Barbie. Thank you.
Next slide, please. So I'm going to take a minute and it explains our involvement. Once an investigation report is approved, the Office of Recommendations is more focused on engagement with recommendation recipients to track and encourage the implementation of the recommendation. And you might say that my staff is not only diligent and committed in this, but they're pretty tenacious as well, I would have to say. We typically deal with recommendation recipients that they were issued recommendations, after a traumatic event, sometimes the worst event of their career or lives. And we take this into account, obviously. Sometimes the engagement is very, very positive. Sometimes it's a little rough. It just sort of depends. So we highlighted 2 recommendations already to NFPA and to the state of Washington that were implemented this last quarter. What I'm going to talk about is some of that engagement, and with 3 recommendation recipients in particular that involve 23 recommendations, so quite a few. I'm not going to focus so much on the incident. I'm more going to talk about the engagement, because the engagement leads to recommendation implementation. First is the Carrare Pasadena release and fire. It occurred on May 19th, 2018, when an emergency pressure relief system discharged a flammable vapor in an area that was not safe. There were lots of people in the area. The vapor cloud ignited and 23 workers were injured. As a result of the investigation, we issued a total of 12 recommendations to Carrare, 1 through 12. Next slide, please. They were immediately responsive, I have to say. They had already been pretty well engaged with the investigation. They knew a lot of what we were going to do, but as soon as the report came out and we asked for information on the recommendations, they responded immediately, and they have been responding ever since. As a result of their 12 recommendations, 6 of them have been closed acceptable action, and the other 6, they had a positive response. We just need some additional information or some additional things to happen first. So Carrare was one of those, again, very responsive. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about Husky Energy Superior Refinery explosion and fire. It happened April 26th of 2018. There was a release of 30,000 pounds of mixed hydrocarbons and 17,000 barrels of asphalt. 36 workers were injured, and as a result of the investigation, 16 recommendations were issued. 7 of those went to Cenovus Superior Refinery. Next slide, please. They've also been highly responsive. They have provided detailed responses. They engage with us very, very well, and they've been a pleasure to work with. As a result of their engagement and actions right up front and their responsiveness, they closed 6 of the 7 recommendations acceptable action. The only reason the last recommendation hasn't been closed out is because we're specifically waiting for the next turnaround, and you really can't rush that kind of thing or change the times on those. So again, Cenovus, outstanding recommendation recipient to work with, very engaged, very responsive. Next slide, please. And lastly, I'm going to talk about Optima Bell, the Optima Bell explosion and fire that occurred December 8th of 2020. This was a result of a decomposition reaction resulting in explosions, fire, and a large chlorine release. There was 1 fatality, 2 injured workers, 1 injured member of the public. And as a result of that investigation, we issued 15 recommendations, and 4 of those were to Optima Bell LLC. Next slide, please. They have also been very communicative. As a matter of fact, the feedback I've gotten from my staff is not only did they work with us very, very well, and we also pull in the investigator in charge, and we all work through these recommendations as we get the responses, but they've been one of the most pleasant exchanges of information that we've ever had. Everything about our engagement with them has been positive. As a result, all 4 of those recommendations have been closed. And again, these are not like easy recommendations. These are things that involve changes and policy that covers the entire facility. These involve training. They involve policy, or like say policy changes that require a whole lot of engagement and a lot of time and effort. And so what we want to do, and the reason that we presented these, is to encourage this kind of responsiveness. The kind of responsiveness that these folks have shown have obviously, they've closed recommendations, they've closed them quickly, they've closed them well. And that is what we'd like to see, obviously, with all of our recommendations. That concludes the presentation from the Office of Recommendations. And with this, I will pass it back to Executive Director Kleist. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Chuck, and thank you to the members of the recommendations team. As Chuck mentioned, when an investigation is adopted by the board, work at this agency does not stop at that point. The recommendations team continues working with recommendation recipients multiple years beyond the closure of the investigation itself. And this important work helps advance safety within the chemical industry through the implementation of these very important recommendations. So thank you again, Chuck, and your team. The next 2 presentations will be made from the Office of Investigations. The first presentation will be made by Senior Chemical Incident Investigator Dan Talima on the accidental release reporting role. So Dan, you may proceed.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Dan Talima, and I'm providing the update on our accidental release program. If I could get the next slide, Ray. There we go. Most of you probably know we are putting this spreadsheet on our website with updated information about once a quarter. This screenshot is from the current version that we released this week. There are 388 accidental release events, which works out to about 8 events per month. And as you can see, the serious injury is the #1 consequence that triggers reporting. Next slide. This graph shows the number of accidental release events monthly using a 3-month moving average. This graph shows an upward trend in the number of accidental release events over time. And the next slide. And this chart shows the actual number of accidental release events per month. You can still see the number of events has been increasing, but the upward trend may not be as apparent as it is in the moving average chart. All right, next slide. And as most folks likely know, our accidental release reporting rule is 40 CFR Part 1604, which went into effect on the 15-year anniversary of the BP Texas City disaster. We issued our guidance document on the rule in 2022, and I'm showing our legislative authority here to show how similar and closely aligned our authority is to the reporting rule. And the next slide. On this final slide, I'll cover some important updates about our accidental release program. The first is Pathways. Pathways is a government program to provide a route for recent college graduates to enter government service. We're excited to have this program back at the CSB. We went about a decade without using this program, but we have 3 great folks working on the accidental release program now, and we're looking to add additional positions in the near future. The next bullet is about incident reports. When we receive a report about an accidental release, the immediate thing we do is decide whether or not to deploy an investigation team. For the events where we do not deploy an investigation team, we send the company a document request seeking its investigation report and the supporting information that backs up the findings, conclusions, and corrective actions. With that information, we are working to fulfill our obligation in the second bullet from our legislative authority to determine and report to the public in writing the facts, conditions, and circumstances, and the cause or probable cause. Our current vision for these reports is to publish a summary of the event and a probable cause statement. These reports are still in the development phase, but we plan to be in a better position to discuss these reports in a future business meeting. And finally, as part of our development work on the accidental release program, we have developed an accidental release database to help us with all phases of this program. First, the database is where we capture the information about the reported accidental release event. And this part of the database contains all the information listed within the reporting rule. The next part of the database helps us manage and track all the document requests we are issuing. In the past, when I led one of our deployment investigations, our team might issue 6 to 12 document requests with maybe 200 to 500 total items, and spreadsheets work well for that type of workload. For this program, however, we needed a more robust data management system, and the database does an excellent job of helping us manage this program. Next, the database houses an investigation summary of the accidental release events. The main menu page for this part of the database is shown on the right. Here we document the event summary and probable cause with 9 additional menus on the right side. Each opens another page to capture additional information about the event, ranging from the chemicals released, the NAICS code for the process involved, the mode of operation, and a panoply of causal factors we want to track. This database is an internal tool, but we are looking to increase transparency and start developing the second generation of this database. Our vision for Gen 2 is to develop an online system that provides public access to the investigation summary information and most of the information reported about each event. And that concludes my update on the accidental release program.
Thank you, Dan. I'd like to recognize Dan Tolima for putting together the framework for the accidental release reporting rule program and making it the success that it is today. In relative terms, the program is only 4 years old compared to the agency's total history, but this program has allowed the agency to take additional actions and be more aware of some of the incidents that take place that would have benefit from investigative work to improve safety in the industry. Our next presentation will be made by Melike Yersis. She is the investigator in charge of the Marathon Martinez Renewable Fuels investigation. So Melike, please proceed.
Thank you. Today, I'm going to give you a brief update on our ongoing investigation into the furnace tube rupture and fire at the Marathon Martinez Renewables facility in Martinez, California. Next slide, please. We released an investigation update on this incident in February of this year. Today, I'm going to take you through some of the content in this document. You can download and read the document on our website at csb.gov. It's only about 4 pages long, including pictures, so I encourage you to take a look. This incident occurred on November 19th, 2023, shortly after midnight. A furnace tube ruptured and a fire erupted during a unit's initial startup. At the time of the tube rupture, an operator was standing next to the furnace, and he was seriously injured from the fire with third-degree burns over 80% of his body. This facility operated as a petroleum refinery for over 100 years under various owners. Marathon purchased the refinery in 2018 and idled it in 2020 during the COVID pandemic. In the following years, Marathon converted the petroleum refinery into a renewables facility by repurposing some of the existing refinery equipment, installing new equipment, and reconfiguring piping to convert the designs into renewable fuel processing units. Next slide, please. The furnace was a fired heater with 11 burners along the bottom that heated up the process that was flowing through the tubes. In the hour leading up to the tube rupture, operators noticed high temperatures on the tubes inside the furnace, and high temperature alarms started to come in. Marathon staff began taking various troubleshooting steps which included attempting to increase flow rate through the furnace to act as a heat sink to take away the heat and cool down the tube metal surfaces. However, these actions were not sufficient to lower the temperatures. Marathon staff then sent a field operator to turn off 2 of the 4 burners that were in service at the time. The field operator went up to the side of the furnace and used the manual burner fuel gas valves indicated in the picture to shut down 2 of the burners. Shortly afterwards, a tube ruptured in the upper section of the furnace, called the convection section, and released renewable diesel and hydrogen that was contained at pressures greater than 600 psig. The field operator was in harm's way when the released material ignited almost immediately and the fire erupted. Next slide, please. The day after the incident, Marathon found that a normally closed bypass valve was open, creating a potential flow path around the furnace. The furnace was equipped with a flow meter that was configured to automatically shut down the furnace when it detected low flow conditions. However, this bypass valve was downstream of that flow meter, and the potential low flow condition was not detected during the incident, neither by the safety instrumented system nor the Marathon staff that were attempting to troubleshoot the high temperatures in the furnace. The bypass flow around the furnace would have robbed the furnace of the heat sink needed to ensure that the furnace tube metal stayed within its temperature design limits. Next slide, please. Our investigation is ongoing. We're currently analyzing the results of metallurgical testing done on tube samples extracted from the furnace with our metallurgist. In addition, we're looking at relevant Martinez facility and Marathon corporate documents, as well as relevant industry standards in the development of our causal analysis and potential recommendations. We look forward to sharing the results of our analysis when our investigation is completed. Thank you.
Thank you, Melly Kay, for the presentation and your work and your leadership in the investigation of the Marathon Martinez Renewable investigation. The next 2 incidents I'm going to report about are a result of the work that developed from the accidental release reporting rule. As Chair Owens said in his opening remarks, the agency has implemented investigations at the Dow Chemical facility, as well as the Honeywell facility in Louisiana. Both of these incidents were reported to the CSB through the accidental release reporting rule, and we examined the incidents that are reported to us, and these 2 rose to the level of additional investigative work, and therefore they have been elevated to more formal investigations. And we have 2 teams that are working on both of these investigations. The Dow incident took place on July 14th, 2023. It was a fire and explosion that occurred at the facility in Plaquemine, Louisiana. Dow reported to the CSB that a detonation occurred in the pipe segment from an ethylene oxide pressure relief system within a glycol manufacturing unit. Hot combustible gases subsequently entered the distillation column reflux drum, creating pressure conditions that ruptured the pressure vessel. Ethylene oxide that passed through the rupture disc contacted air within the downstream piping, triggered a fire and explosion. Local officials ordered a shelter in place of hundreds of residents within a half-mile of the facility. Unfortunately, no injuries were reported as a result of this incident. The second investigation that we've implemented, again, as part of the accidental release reporting rule program, is the investigation that took place, or the incident that took place on January 23rd of 2023 at the Honeywell facility in Geismar, Louisiana. This incident involved a heat exchanger rupture resulting in an explosion and the release of approximately 870 pounds of hydrofluoride and 1,700 pounds of chlorine, both highly toxic materials. Local officials, again, closed nearby highways, and workers at the facility were ordered to shelter in place. Again, fortunately, no injuries were reported as a result of this incident. The property damage was rather significant. The company reported an estimate of over $4 million in property damage. But these are typical of the investigations that we hope to identify as a result of the incidents being reported through the reporting rule. And when we have investigative resources to move these to a more formal investigation level, this is the agency's plan as we continue to move forward with improving chemical safety within the industry. As the chairperson said, also, the work continues on the BP Husky investigation, and that is scheduled for completion before the next public meeting. Finally, I'd just like to provide everyone with an update on our recruitment action and the implementation of our human capital program. We have a job posting that will be available Monday, the 29th of this month at USA Jobs, and it calls for the recruitment of multiple positions as chemical engineers to support the Office of Investigations and the accomplishment of the agency's core mission. So we would like to make sure everyone is aware that those opportunities will be available fairly soon. With that, I will turn the presentation back over to Chairperson Owens.
Well, thank you, Steve. And again, thank everyone for participating today, and especially the folks in our staff who gave those tremendous presentations. I hope all of you who are viewing this can see the kind of work that is being done and has been done at the agency. I just want to add a couple of comments to what was said by the presenters, most specifically and recently with regard to what Steve just said. We are hiring. We are in need of additional investigators as we continue to do work to rebuild and revitalize this agency. We are very appreciative of the strong bipartisan support that we've received from the Congress, not only during the time that I've been on the board, but years previous to that. And we were very grateful that the Congress did not cut our funding during this current fiscal year, but instead let us continue on with the current level of funding so we can do exactly what Steve said, which is recruit and then hopefully hire additional chemical engineers and other individuals to serve as investigators, as well as in other crucial need areas that we have at the agency. So we appreciate that. And we're also very appreciative of President Biden, of course, for his strong support of this agency and for his request and funding for the next fiscal year to increase our funding so we can continue to grow the agency and continue to do the kind of job that Congress and the American people expect and hope that we will be doing here at the CSB, and is certainly in our plan of action moving forward to continue to focus on the things that we've discussed here today. Just a couple of other quick comments, and then we will open it up for your comments. With regard to the accidental release reporting rule, as both Dan and Steve indicated, this is really a priority for us. Now, the reporting rule has been in effect roughly 4 years. As Dan indicated, so far we've received 388 incident reports. We actually have received more than that, but those are the ones that are fall within the requirement that they be reported. Some entities out there actually over-report just as an abundance of caution to be sure that they are complying with the rule, and we very much appreciate that. But those 388 are the ones that do fall with the four corners of the rule and are required to be reported. And many times over the last few years, and certainly in the time that I've been on the board, we are being asked, what is it that we do with all that data that we collect? And we hope that the presentation that Dan gave today and some of the other things we've talked about will help give you at least a bit of insight into it. We certainly have plans to move forward, as Dan indicated, to not only produce incident reports that will be short reports on many of the many of the incidents that have been reported to us, but some of them will be expanded into larger reports. And if some of those seem appropriate, we will include recommendations in them as well. And some, of course, may turn into actual on-the-ground deployments, as we did with both the Honeywell and Dow incidents that were reported to us under the reporting rule. Even though those occurred a year ago in 2023, that is our hope and certainly our plan that we will continue to be able to go back and review previously submitted reports to us to determine whether any of those need to be further investigated in terms of assigning the kind of resources that we've assigned to both the Honeywell and Dow investigations. And then, as Dan also mentioned, it is also our goal to provide an accessible database so that members of the public can have even more information about the CSB's work on the accidental reporting rule and the kind of reports that we're receiving about chemical incidents around the country. And then just very quickly, I just want to add that with regard to what Chuck Barbie said, Chuck being our director of recommendations at the agency, about the level of cooperation that we've received from some recipients of our recommendations. In the agency's history, the agency has issued almost 1,000 recommendations, not quite there yet, 900 and some odd recommendations. Many of those have been closed over the years. I think roughly around 90% or so have been closed, and many of those are closed, as was alluded to by Chuck, as acceptable action. And that's because of the cooperation we get from recommendation recipients. And we try to craft recommendations that are implementable. We work with all the parties who are involved in the investigations to try to develop the kinds of recommendations that not only can be implemented, but are going to make the biggest difference in terms of safety for people who work at the facilities, as well as families who live near them, so we can ensure that we are protecting communities and workers in the environment to the greatest extent possible here. But it isn't always like that with some recommendations. Some recipients are a little less cooperative than these, and we urge recipients who may think it may be more advantageous to them to either not comply or not work closely with us as we try to find a way for them to implement the recommendations, to please work with us on that, to understand that the ultimate goal here is protecting communities, protecting workers, and protecting the environment. And the more we can all do that together, then the better off everyone is going to be. With all of that said, I will now open it up for public comments. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, please keep your comments to 3 minutes. And if you can, please raise your hand. Use the icon on your computer to raise your hand so that Ray can recognize you and then unmute you. Again, if you don't feel comfortable or have a longer question, then you can, or comment rather, or have a specific question that you'd like an answer to, please send that to us at public@csb.gov. And with that, Ray, I'll turn it over to you to open us up.
Yep, just as Steve mentioned, you can use the raise hand feature in Zoom, and you'll just jump to the top of my list, and then you would have 3 minutes for your comments, and I'll bring you to the floor.
We've overwhelmed them, as we always do, with information. So.
Yeah.
We'll give it a few more minutes. See if anyone has any comments.
Yep, and I'm just keeping an eye on my window here. So.
Yep. Well, if not, we'll wrap it up then. Since we don't see any commenters at the moment, hopefully folks will send in, as I said, questions or any comments they may have to public@csb.gov, and I'll ask both Board Member Sylvia Johnson and Board Member Kathy Sandoval if they have closing remarks they'd like to provide. So, Sylvia.
Well, thank you, Steve. I would just like to say thank you again to everyone for attending today's meeting, but also a huge thank you to the entire CSB team for the work that they continue to do. As you said in your opening, we got the backlog done, and now we've got a lot of other irons in the fire, and this team continues to produce and deliver every single day. And they're doing it in a way that shows their commitment to the American public, to communities, to workers, and the environment. So I'd like to thank the team, and I hope to see all of you again in July.
And thank you, Sylvia. And just wanted to echo the thanks both to the CSB team and emphasize this is a whole of team effort. So, you see our investigators and our recommendation team, but we also couldn't do this without everyone on our staff, from our HR team, our finance team, our legal team, our admin team. Everyone is absolutely crucial to this effort, and is also emphasized with regard to both the investigations and recommendation. This really is a whole of community effort. So there's this concept that's used, especially in disaster planning and response, that you need the whole community to effectively plan for disaster response. And you need to take into account the interests and needs of the whole community. So that's something that we are trying to do in looking at the impacts of these incidents on the whole community, but also as we see the whole community, including those who represent operators, investors, insurers, that they also need to be part of this because these incidents also affect facilities that are designated as critical infrastructure, in addition to creating hazards that can be fatal for people and affect the environment. So really would like to thank all of you for being part of the whole community dedicated to preventing chemical safety releases and to protecting workers, communities, the environment, and our critical infrastructure. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Sylvia and Kathy. With that, we'll wrap it up. Just want to remind everyone that we hold these meetings quarterly. Our next meeting will be on July 25th, also at 2 p.m. Eastern time, and we hope all of you will join us at that time. So with that, Ray, we'll adjourn.
Sounds like a plan. Thanks, everybody.